G'day, I'm Ali Amo, and this is the A Lease on Life podcast. We're going to have a little bit of a switch up today and focus more so on the science element within the power strand. Alja is an academically trained scientist with a background in natural health. She has a PhD in neuroscience, and she recently left the academic world to work with entrepreneurs, helping them to remove their subconscious programming so that they can skyrocket their business. And Alja is coming to us from Germany. So hi, Alja. Thanks for being with us today.
Hi. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
What made you get into neuroscience of all of the fields and disciplines there are?
That's actually a very good question. The irony of that never ceases to amaze me. But when I was 18, I chose to go study neuroscience, which at the time meant I had to leave my home country of Slovenia. I moved to England. And it was quite a big ordeal, right? Because you cannot just do neuroscience anywhere, especially not at the undergraduate level. I really thought I would be the person to develop a pill for neuropsychiatric diseases. So I was like, we're going to cure depression, we're going to cure anxiety, we're going to do these things. Of course, things turned out very differently. The other aspect I would say is also that, and that's a little bit more in hindsight, really noticing I've always been very, very curious about psychology, human behavior. Why do we do what we do? Like, why do we behave the way we behave, especially when it comes to behaviors that are objectively speaking destructive, right, to us and our environment and so on. But I didn't want to study psychology. I wanted to study really the scientific basis. And so I was kind of like, well, neuroscience sounds like a great place to do that. That was about 10 years ago now that I moved to England and studied my undergraduate studies there.
How long were you studying altogether?
So 4 years of bachelor's plus master. And then I moved to Germany and that was another 5 years of a PhD. So a long time.
The time you actually chose to study this is really interesting because there's been so many developments that what you learnt from the beginning would have been rapidly evolving over time. The whole time you were doing your studies would have been a lot of new information coming, whether that be through your own independent research or coming through the education system itself.
Oh, yeah, 100%. There are a lot of fields right now developing very rapidly, neuroscience specifically. So it's important to understand that neuroscience is a very large field, right? We're looking at a huge proportion of it working really on like super basic level. We're looking at the cellular level or even the level of single molecules. Then the level that I worked on at the PhD is working with animal models. So you're going one level up and you're saying, how do the systems in the brain, let's say, work? It's called systems neuroscience. And then there's a whole other field that is looking at human neuroscience. And each of them use specific tools. And especially the field that I've been in, there's been a lot of development of new tools, right? And tools are the ones that their science kind of goes through periods of a lot of biology being developed and then new tools coming out that help us, view biology in different ways. So before the microscope existed, like we didn't know there were cells and microorganisms and the like. And neuroscience is going right now through a huge era of new tool development that is letting us actually do absolutely crazy stuff. Like it's magic when you really look at what we can do with it. So just the amount of science coming out is enormous. It's near impossible to keep up, quite frankly. Like even people who are at the forefront, they're kind of like, oh my God, there's so much. But more than the how much science is coming out, the question is, and that's what I've been asking myself a lot is, what do we do with that information? How do we, from all these little pieces that we're discovering, that are, of course, experiments and in very specific conditions, with very specific outcomes that are or aren't reproducible, right? It's a whole other conversation. But then how do we actually take this information and do something with it? Like, how does that help us actually understand the bigger picture? And this is where I struggled a lot in science. This is why I eventually left it, because I thought a lot of it was really stuck on these minutiae. And then when you took a step back and looked at it, you were like, what is even going on here? Like, what is important? What is not important? What am I looking at? And I think this is a huge problem right now, actually, in the neuroscientific field. There's too much information. People don't know what to do with it.
It seems sort of like I'm viewing it almost like this huge 1,000-piece puzzle, and some people get so caught up on their one little piece. Whereas if you're taking the bigger picture in mind at all times, you can try and see how things fit, but you can very much
Yeah.
get lost in some of the beliefs. You get stuck in science a lot with the beliefs that
Oh,
we all
yeah.
have.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
and you become narrow-minded, and sometimes we get information from different experiments and theories that contradict, that won't be accepted for the pure fact that
All
it
the time.
challenges the stuff that we
Yeah.
rest on.
Yeah.
Was
Yeah.
it
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Totally.
did you have a lot of other females working with you and studying with you?
Yeah. So neuroscience is actually very diverse, which is really, really nice. So our undergraduate program was about 50-50. And then even down the line during my PhD, I think there were more women actually working in the lab than men. So it kind of goes like this, right? Biology tends to attract more women. More technical subjects on average attract more men. And neuroscience really lies at the intersection of the two. So it's a very, very technical field that attracts a lot of physicists, attracts a lot of computer scientists because the data you're dealing with is just like humongous now. And so it's actually pretty equal, I would say. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm curious to know your opinion about some of the information that you were exposed to. What's something that you learned that sort of shocked you and challenged something that you used to believe when you were studying neuroscience?
I think this is something that everyone who really did science at a deep level will tell you. And this is that science is presented and kind of the public sphere. I oftentimes like to say that science has become a new religion. And people
Mm,
really believe, people have these things of like, oh, I believe in science, which is a sentence that makes no sense because if you understand what science is, science has zero to do with dogma, right? Science is an ever evolving field subject. Every time we think we learned something, there's so much more we haven't learned yet, right? Every answer you find out, there are 10 new questions, 100 new questions that open up. And to me, what really became very clear is that it is not clear cut. A lot of people are like, oh, these are the facts. Like you do this experiment and you get this like clear result out of it. And this is just absolutely not the case, right? Depending on the field, depending on the type of experiment you do, there may be times when you get like a really nice, really clear cut result. But the more complex the systems that you work with, the more variables you take into consideration, the more you shift conditions and change them, the more you realize you're kind of looking at this like very volatile space almost where, even I've seen some very, I'm just going to say it, very questionable science being published in very, very high journals. We're talking Nature, we're talking Science, like top of the tops, like science and results that quite frankly, I don't believe. And you would need to do a lot more to convince me that were true. Why personally I knew very early on I would leave academia, but why also a lot of other people leave academia is that it really is about publishing. Scientific world is very cutthroat. What it's really all about is publishing papers and publishing papers in good journals, publishing enough papers. Depending on, where exactly in academia you are, depending on the institution, it differs a bit. But you have to fight for funding. You apply for normally external funding because for the vast majority of academics, the funding they receive from the institutions they're at is not sufficient to actually allow them to do good research. And what that means is that that's really the priority. That is really the priority. And we know in science there have been documented cases of data being forged where papers had to be retracted. You will see practices that are more or less good scientific practices in order to achieve what the end goal is, getting these publications. And so everything's really focused there. So oftentimes I'm going to say it, science may suffer because of that. You may, try to fast track certain things. You may push people really hard. Most people I met in academia are not having exactly the best time of their life because a lot of bosses require you to work 60, 70 hours a week for a barista like salary. So, and that again, that depends. That's like obviously a generalization. There is a lot of difference there, but it is not a pleasant world to be in. And what I learned through some quite unpleasant experiences during my own journey was that science was not a priority. At some point, neither science nor the people were a priority. A priority was for if you were in more of a junior group, for your boss to get a permanent position. If you're later down the line, a lot of the time, those same people kind of stopped caring that much about science and were more interested in doing higher level administrative things in like societies or whatnot. So a lot of students are lacking supervision. A lot of the time, the science is suffering because of that. Also, because people may not get the help that they need, right? There is still this hierarchy. Hierarchy is a big deal in academia, and it's a very patriarchal, very set in stone system where a lot of people still work with this idea in mind that you have one person per project. This is how it used to be, and you have your own project, that's your baby. But the problem is that right now the complexity has increased so much from how it was even 20, 30 years ago that there's no way that one person can handle one project. And what is demanded for a good publication to happen? What a journal like Nature or Science demand to have in one paper, it's almost impossible for that to be executed by one person. And so you're having all these things when people are doing 5 things at the same time. They're not really experts in any of them, or it takes a really long time to get there. And, we had multiple people in our lab that it took them 6, 7 years before they published and graduated. I personally was there for 4.5 years, and I did not publish because it would take another 1, 2, 3 years for that to be finished. And I was not willing to do that. And that's becoming quite a common theme in the specific subfield that I was in. Again, this will depend where you are at. Seeing all of these things, it's a little bit of a disillusionment. I feel like everywhere else in this world that it's ruled by capitalism, you start seeing the same theme, right? Money is the priority, and the systems are built around that. And it loses its magic. The priorities shift to things they should have never shifted to. So it's no longer about doing really quality science, taking your time, making sure that everybody can really do that. But it's these systems that it's kind of like you're pushing and pulling, and there's so much conflict, and you should be doing this thing over here, but actually you have to be doing this thing over here. And yeah, it was not a pleasant environment to be at all. Right now, this is actually becoming a huge problem. And I was at some very, very good institutions. People are really struggling to find good postdocs, people who are going to do science there, because so many of us are leaving academia after the PhDs because we just don't want this anymore.
I actually did an episode on this recently, looking at sugar science and the secrets. And what it
Mhm.
seems like, this was in the 50s and 60s, but I call these what you're describing as the cycles within science. We do have a lot of, I don't know if influencers is the right word, but we have a lot of people in social media becoming a little bit popular, and they've got this background in some form of science. There's a lot of neuroscience, but they're not really practicing as scientists anymore. They're just sharing information and taking a different
Yes.
perception. But when I did the episode, I was looking at the funding and how that can really skew the data. And I wanted to ask you about that actually from your experience. It makes sense if you're going to secure funding for a project from a certain group. That group has to have a vested interest. They're not just doing it for the sake of let's uncover the mystery, let's just see what we find. They usually have a motive to want to find certain data that'll benefit them and almost come back to them tenfold. And was that something that you experienced yourself?
No. The reason why not is because our research was not translational. So when we're looking at translational research, we're talking about taking research and turning it into a product. So we didn't work at that level. And this is where you start getting funding from companies, from pharma, etc. So I personally was isolated from that. Now, that absolutely does not mean that doesn't happen. It happens. We know it. That's been shown in so many cases throughout the history. And normally we have to look maybe 10, 20, 30 years back to see how big food was influencing certain research. It's happening all the time. So in every scientific publication, what you should see at the end of it is a declaration of conflict of interest. And so you should be able to see with every publication if any of the funding came from sources that could have something to profit from it. Now, does that happen every time? I don't believe so. It should, right? So what's happening, basic research is really looking at low level research before you get to this translational stage. This is where I work. What happens here is a little bit of a different thing, but it's still important to acknowledge that science also goes like everything else. It's influenced by what is sexy right now. That's what I like to call it. And so funding will be predominantly allocated to science that is pop at the moment, that is like seen as popular and worthy of being funded. And a lot of very good science may not get funding because it's just not sexy enough. This is what personally bothered me in this when I was looking at it, is that a lot of this basic research, you are not going to get anything that is really going to be useful to anyone. But because of the way that funding works, like directly, right? They write up this elaborate applications for grants, for example, where they state all of these things of like how this is relevant to curing this disease and this and this and this in order to get the funding. And there's this weird mash of things where you're actually saying something that cannot be true. Like if you really follow it down and say, okay, what if everything you're saying would actually be fulfilled? What then? And you realize there's a wall. Like there's no way to actually turn that into a product. There's no way to actually do anything. And there's nothing wrong with this, right? Like we need to understand science for the sake of science is just about exploring our reality. But we got this weird mishmash of these things now when you have to kind of pretend that you're doing this for a different reason in order to get funding. And then you're kind of lying to yourself, you're lying to others. Like it's a very kind of weird conundrum of these things happening in the scientific world that is taking away from just this desire to explore reality. And that was also something for me. We would have these conversations about, oh, and then if we find these things, maybe we can help people with anxiety. And then you're like, but how? Are you going to drill holes into their skulls? Are you going to put something in their brain? Like, we don't do that. Let's say extreme cases of epilepsy, right? And certain neurodegenerative diseases, if there's absolutely no other intervention, you can stick electrodes. Like, it does happen, but we're talking, this is like really extreme case scenarios, right? This is not that you're going to go to your doctor and be like, I've been feeling a bit anxious. And they're like, right, let's drill, you know? And there's this just lack of, to me, willingness to see what is true, what we can do with this. Where is this going? What is the end goal? What is the intention? And if we lose focus on what the intention is, we cannot actually drive the process in the right way. So this was something I saw a lot in my specific subfield that I thought was not exactly constructive and leading to the results we said we wanted.
From what you're telling me, the way I've sort of understood this, I'm looking more at the foundation stream, which is relationships and environment. And it seems that in order to develop science, when you're trying to build the foundation of the knowledge that you will then build upon, there needs to be this relationship or connection to, we're doing this to create this product. It's for something to help people in society. So instead of just trying to form a foundational basis for our knowledge to build on and for the research to go in the path that it needs to, it seems to be everything needs to have a purpose, and that purpose is the end result of a product to make somebody money to do something, whether it's really effective or the ineffectiveness isn't outweighed by the positive benefits that you could get from things. Neuroscience is fairly new in comparison to a lot of the other disciplines that we have, but it's also evolving because it's so new. And if there's, as you say, a bit of a struggle to establish correct foundations to build off, and things have to go so far in advance of where something may go to, that means the research and experimentation will be gearing towards that instead of actually uncovering the mysteries. There's corruption in and of itself in that process because it's not finding things for the sake of finding truth. It's always looking towards a future that, from what you're saying, doesn't even sound like it matches a lot of the time.
Yeah, and there are a couple of things to unpack that make this quite a complex conversation. And it's a conversation people don't want to have, but I'll bring it here. I think humans, we generally have a problem of getting clarity on where the heck we're going and then aligning our actions with that, right? Because we know that in general, without focus, we get lost. And in science, without focus, you get lost because there's always so much more. It never ends, right? And science anyway functions in this way that it breaks things down into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller components, which anyways is not really conducive to understanding like the truth, right? The truth that a lot of us are looking for, which is the interconnectedness of everything, right? The web of life, like studying the ecosystems and studying at the grander scale gets you to the truth a lot quicker than breaking things down into smaller and smaller compounds. But because we are constantly developing tools to see things with higher resolution and to see more precisely and classify things here and classify things there and so on, it's very easy to get lost. Here, I think that we need to always have the question. We have to keep this question at the back of my mind of why are we doing something? It is important, and it's important for a couple of really big reasons, because I think it's beautiful that we go and explore things just for the sake of exploring things. It's beautiful to do that. And when we are having huge amounts of money involved in that, when we are murdering animals, and I'm going to say it as it is, murdering tens, hundreds, thousands of animals for experiments, we're taking lives for that. We should ask ourselves, is that actually leading us somewhere beyond just the never ending pursuit of more and more and more and more and more information that we don't know what to do with? And this is a conversation people in science do not want to have. They will have to have it because, well, depending where you are, United States, for example, are very relaxed with their animal regulation. Germany is not. So they are now cracking down. It's getting harder and harder to do animal experiments. And sometimes these regulations, quite frankly, don't make much sense because people who make them may not have that much experience with it. But on the other hand, I still do believe we should have very stringent regulations because you work with living beings. These are living beings with feelings, with emotions, with their own experiences. It is absolutely, in my eyes, absolutely unacceptable not to talk about this, not to have these conversations. Because scientists really don't want to have these conversations. We will have conversations like, you should never talk about these things in the public because people get really upset about this and all of that. But it is the truth, you know? And because of this, I think it's very important that we do keep at the back of our mind, what is the intention? Is what we're saying that we're achieving truly what we can achieve through these means? Especially when it comes to things, and this is where I have to leave science with my knowledge from other fields. When we're talking about things like depression, when we're talking about things like anxiety, those things do not get resolved through neural intervention. They will not, because the lack of a certain drug is not the cause of anxiety. The lack of an electrode in your brain is not the cause of anxiety. The causes are environmental. The causes are toxicity. The causes are, emotional addictions. The causes are society being structured in a way that is absolutely not conducive to humans or environment thriving, right? And there are so many other interventions, quote unquote, lifestyle changes, so many things you can do that have been shown both anecdotally and scientifically over and over again to work for these things. But again, they don't generate profit. So prescribing someone pills is always going to be preferable in the current system. And to me, this is somewhere where it's time we stop lying to ourselves. And of course, that's not a popular opinion amongst those communities, but it is simply the truth. We have ways that we can help people with that. We have many, many avenues. Why do we keep pushing this research further and further and further with this specific intention, presumably, that cannot actually get us to the end result, but we don't want to have a conversation around that? And this is something that I thought was lacking severely in these communities. This is something where I think the focus is really important and just getting so honest with ourselves. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? Where is this going? Instead of throwing hundreds of thousands of euro for one lab every year into research that at the end of the day, you don't even bother publishing it as a paper, which is the bare minimum. So this is kind of the quote unquote dark side of this kind of research. And again, people don't want to talk about it, but we have to talk about it because avoiding the truth has never, ever, ever brought anything constructive to us.
I agree. When something gets published in a prestigious journal, it actually shapes the way the world and the scientific community, the consensus about a certain topic. It can be misleading at times. There's been instances where the information that's published was incorrect, or they've found out later that the scientists has lied or fudged their own data. There was even a case where someone had never did a study whatsoever and just fabricated the entire thing. So the risk when you focus on getting things published, like you're saying, there are whole areas that are not publishing and whole labs that are not publishing what they've found, but there must be a kind of hierarchy within the journals themselves about what's sexy, as you call it.
Oh,
They want to
yeah.
they want to
Oh,
focus
yeah.
on the whatever's getting attention at the time and share the research on that. And even that, you need to think about the way it's building the picture. It shapes how we perceive, it shapes how the scientific community perceives, and it very much paves a path for further experimentation and research to develop. And it's probably going in the wrong way because these journals are in it for their own purposes as well. It's not just, let's just share what we've been finding.
Yeah, but 100%. And I mean, it's always difficult to say, is it going in the wrong direction? Is this going in the right direction? Because I would still say probably, there is some truth in a lot of what's published. Now, always, always, one thing we can never forget if we're looking at the basic level science is every experiment is done under very specific conditions. Most of the time, how those experiments are done is not how the brain necessarily operates out in the wild, quote unquote, right? So you always have to take it with a grain of salt. But if we go deeper a little bit on what you said before, we also all know in the scientific community that when you're sending a paper to a publisher, if the person who signs off on that paper is a very well recognized person, there's a much higher chance that that paper will end up being published. If you're a new lab from not a well known institution, it's going to be much harder. Scientific community has been talking for a very long time about having a double blind process for paper revisions because it's not done. You get the paper, you see immediately what lab it's coming from, who did it. Do those people have a reputation? Are there some, there's politics. There's a lot of politics in academia, like everywhere else. So for a long time, scientists have been speaking out about wanting this process where it can actually be objective, where you just look at the science, right? And it's not done. It's not done, right? Which is kind of like the bare minimum you would really expect, given that, at least clinical trials really are supposed to all be double blind for that exact reason. And it's not. So there's a lot of this going on, a lot of politics. Is it the right time for this? A lot more than just science. There are two more things that are really important to understand. So myself and many other people, like from the beginning on when I started, I was like, we need a journal of negative data. When there's data published that did not produce positive results, because that data tells us just as much. But it's not, right? So then we're cycling, repeating experiments and all of that. So that would be really good to just have data out there so you could publish that as well, because that's still science. You still discovered something, right? But it's not viewed as such. You're just like, oh, you didn't confirm the hypothesis, too bad. Like throw it in the bin, even though there was, again, like a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of energy invested. Last thing that's really big as well is, as always, when you go into these systems that are based upon massive accumulation of profits, whatnot, capitalism, you're in this fight or flight state. You enter competition rather than collaboration, which we all know it's not how healthy systems work. And so here as well, instead of two labs who realizing that they're doing a similar thing, stepping together and collaborating, which happens sometimes, they will compete. And you then will be running the same project and they'll be angry with one another and all of this. Whereas in reality, you should just step together and do it. Another point here worth mentioning is also that just like everywhere else, when you have these big institutions with a lot of money, they can produce much better research. Then they get published in better journals and then they get more money again. So there's actually this huge distribution as well. I know because both of my parents are scientists and my mom often tells me she's not like a pure kind of like research scientist. She's the head of a lab in my home country, Slovenia. And of course, the resources there are very different than being in Germany. And she will say, you go to these big conferences and you see the kind of research others are doing, and you understand you will never, ever, ever be able to compete with them. Not because you don't have brilliant people or knowledge, but you will never get the money to do it, right? So just like everywhere else, science is privilege driven. There's like scientific privilege that's going on in these communities that feeds in and of itself, again, like dependent on this, right? And artificially elevates one country or elevates like one institution above the other simply because of that. Like pretty much everything in our capitalistic society right now is built upon competition rather than collaboration, because you have to be first. You have to get this grant. It's kind of like doing marketing sometimes, which I was really like mind blown at the beginning because I came to my supervisor with this project that I was like, this is really cool. I really want to do this. It is super unique. And she's like, oh, yeah, but, it doesn't really fit in my niche. Like she literally said that because she's like, I have a niche of like this brain region and this kind of thing and all this. And if we start doing this, then we're getting into other people's like niche. And I'm like, is this science or what? Like, what is going on here? But this is a real thing. Wow. So people are really, it's very ego driven. It's like, and I'm going to say this like this, scientists, they see themselves as these celebrities, these big people.
Mm.
They treat each other as like, oh, this person's coming to give a talk. Like they're really big, and really big in the scientific community means that, 30 people know about you. Like it's not Brad Pitt level, but there's a lot of ego here. And
Yeah.
what then happens as a result of that is that, you will really try to drive this, like, I am the best, instead of really, I mentioned before, right? The projects and neuroscience and systems neuroscience right now are so complex that you would need teams of people to do it well. And then you may find some normally kind of more secure group leaders will do this more often, that if they see that there's another lab doing something similar, they'll be like, let's collaborate in this, or let's finish our project and then publish back to back in the same journal. So we send everything at the same time, and let's share results and so on. But I'm going to tell you that's rare. And oftentimes people like see that someone else is doing something different and they're like, oh no, now we have to either speed up, or like, oh, they scooped us, right? That's how it's called. I've seen group leaders, they won't let people go to conferences to present their data to not get scooped, right? For other people not stealing it. And sometimes under really bizarre conditions, like where it just made no sense. It's like it took 7 years to get this project to this stage. Like no one can reproduce it overnight, but they won't allow their students to share it. So there is a lot going on there that has very little to do with science and a lot to do with ego,
Ego.
politics, and fear.
Mm.
It's fear. Underlying, it's fear that if you don't get it, someone else will get it, that you won't get this position. And it's tough world. The longer I am in any like natural healing, like spiritual world intersection of those, I'm seeing that when we are stuck in this fight or flight, when we're stuck in this way of doing things of like, I'm competing with someone else, it starts going very much in the wrong direction. And that's unfortunately the same in science.
That makes total sense. I love the idea of having the negative results being
Oh,
published in its own journal. I think that's necessary, even just for
yeah.
individuals, because certain research could get lost in the world of Google Scholar, I suppose. If it's not published in some prestigious journal, it becomes really difficult to locate. And I can understand that the ego plays a big role. They sound very much like politicians. They might
Oh,
get
yeah.
into it for good reason and they want to create change in the beginning, and then they get sort of into the hype of their own celebrity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I could, and I do on some level understand if you've dedicated your life to a field of research and you tend to have this belief about what you want to find and what you want to show and what it can do for the world. But then you get lost in your own ego, and it would skew not just what you're open to researching, but how you perceive the data that you find as well. So I
Oh,
think,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
but I also imagine in the academic community, as a result of this, it's kind of like celebrities, all the personal assistants and things have all the tea on everybody. So working under certain PIs, as you say, would give you a lot of background into the truth behind their science and the truth behind them as individuals. So there'd be almost like this tea ceremonies where everybody's sharing everything from their lab and who you need to look out for. So
Oh,
even
yeah.
if it makes me question the high profile people that we begin to be introduced to. But the truth is, certain discoveries, we remember what the discovery was, not necessarily the scientist who was behind it. And science gets its own, like it's very much like you said, marketing.
Oh,
The
yeah.
way you were talking, it sounded like marketing. The way you pitch for funding sounded like marketing. The way that you present data sounded like marketing. Like
It is
it's
marketing.
it's very
It is
much taken
marketing.
away from what science is supposed to be in the first place. And that's a
Yes.
bit of a worry because marketing as a field is very misleading at times.
Yeah, for sure. And, here, there are 2 points really big. First of all, it's important to understand that that's also the reason why I would never want to do science is that as you progress more and more and become a leader of, let's say, a lab, you're just a marketer. You don't really do science anymore. You don't run experiments, right? Your whole like purpose is to secure funding and, okay, ideally to supervise people. That's like an ideal case scenario, although that's normally the first thing that falls away.
Mhm.
And then you have to present, to go to conferences and so on. But I think really the thing that you said before about how we remember the findings, rarely the scientists. And for big, big things, we do remember the people for sure. But just like with everything in life, I think you can start creating really massive beauty when you put yourself second. And not in the sense that, you start sacrificing your well-being and all this, but you're here for something greater, right? That was my own journey through the business, where for a while I was quite stuck in this whole, like, 6-figure months, blah, 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 blah. And it didn't resonate. And then once I really like anchored in and I was like, why am I doing this? And I started really putting this vision, right? Things started shifting very quickly for me, both in like terms of, client success, but my personal fulfillment, my personal satisfaction. And I think in science, this is the really big difference. You have these two types of people, and one type of them, one class of them manages to keep this curiosity, this pureness, of their just in love with the process. I actually was lucky enough to grow up with a parent like that. My dad was one of those classical scientists. I actually had a childhood when, I would come downstairs at 7 a.m. and he would sit there with like a pack of papers with equations written all over them. And he would just have these sparkling eyes like this, it's like this pureness. And that is the leading motivation. And then you're really looking at what can I create, right? I think it was in Atomic Habits, the book I'm sure a lot of people know. He says that you don't grow to your goals, you fall to the level of your systems, right? And I think we need to take that not only on the personal level, but also the collective. When there is a system behind it that is promoting this fight or flight, it will drag you down, because that's the game. And you cannot, unfortunately, within these rigid systems for now, you cannot play by your own rules. You can try, you can push the boundaries, but funding is funding. Like whoever gives you the funding gives you the funding. And that drags people down. And I think the question is just like, how much of this pure curiosity do you manage to upkeep in the face of that? Right? That's what I've really seen. And for some people, it really drags them down. Some people started out with an ego-based desires already. Some people wanted to do it because they saw it as a way to, become someone, right? Which is always very dangerous, where ego's like, oh, I have to beat someone, me. And then you see there 100%. But I think for a lot of these people, it's really like they fall to the level of the systems. They go in, they really try to do something better. And then you just get stuck in this like never ending cycle. And, of course, if you don't do your inner work, it's going to be much easier to drag you down. And of course, most of those people don't, right? It's kind of work that's still very much, therapy is becoming a thing now, like the bare freaking minimum. So you see a lot of that. But you do, you see, and you have these people who really keep this incredible just love for science. And that's the main driving motivation. And those people, you normally see that there's a much higher satisfaction amongst people who work with them. Now, how well they manage to succeed will depend really where they are in the funding and all of those things. But that is the class of people that I love having conversations with, because it really is about science. It's about something bigger than just yourself. And that is, ego is always, it's kind of like the pit that you can fall into regardless of where you are. And no, not ego, but it's egotism. I think it's better to say, because there's nothing wrong with ego, but when it becomes egotism, then we start having issues.
It reminds me of that book. Have you ever heard of Seth Speaks, The Eternal Validity of the Soul?
I have heard it, but I don't know it.
There was a line in there that has stayed with me ever since I read it. And it said, the ego was meant to be an aid that has been allowed to become a tyrant. And that very much sounds like the case. You've got people who are trying to serve themselves in science and people who are trying to serve humanity at large. And dependent upon how you flitter between them, and this, it's not just your own personal cycle that you're up against to try and break, that it's the world cycles that are operating in the background that you need to be breaking while you're breaking your own personal stuff. So
Yes.
it sounds like a bit of an uphill battle, and I can totally understand why it got to the point where you would have felt like it wasn't what you thought it was, and it can't be how you want it to be. And, that saying, if you can't beat them, join them, you refuse to do that. So what made you go down the road that you've gone down, and what do you take from your knowledge of neuroscience working with individuals and their subconscious programming?
So the subconscious reprogramming, it's a beautiful modality, because the reason why I went down is that for me, it really kind of were the progression of studying kind of Western scientific system. And I did my PhD in systems neuroscience, but actually at university, I predominantly studied neuropharmacology. So as I
I'm
said, I
going to
was really
stop you there.
interested.
You've lost me. Can you?
Okay.
You just used some really
Yes,
big
yes,
words.
yes. Okay. So
Systems. Yeah.
So systems neuroscience, it really looks at distribution of networks across the brain. So you're looking at a whole system of how it works, multiple regions interacting together within the brain, how they connect with one another. That's what we call systems neuroscience. And it's a bit of a broader field when you're looking, let's say, at whole brain regions and what they do, right? Because you can look at the level of one molecule, one cell, interaction of two cells, and then you can start looking at networks. So connections between the whole regions. So
And the
that's what I
pathways
worked
things
on.
are taking. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. So, yes, you will,
That's
for
sort of making me
example,
think.
yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, it makes me think of the human body. And it's almost like if you're trying to study how, when we eat and drink and how the systems work together, it's kind of that equivalent for the brain. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like
Okay.
this, right? You can look at the liver, you can look at like enzymes, then you can look at cells, then you can look at the whole tissue, right? Or the subsections. It's the same. The brain is the same as the rest of the body, it's just more complicated because it has more cells, right? Brain has just central nervous system has the most cells in the body. So naturally, things are a couple of orders of magnitude more complicated to really understand how they interact. But you can study neuroscience at these different levels. And so during my PhD, what we talked about most up until now was this level of looking at, let's say you can look at one region, whole region, and try to understand what's going on, or you can stimulate a region. So you can activate a region and then see what happens in the rest of the brain. Before, my focus was looking at much, much, much lower levels. So I was looking at individual molecules within neural cells and how specific drugs affect them. So that's called pharmacology, is the knowledge of how different substances affect the body. Neuropharmacology simply means you're looking at a central nervous system, at neuronal cells. And so, which makes sense, right? Because I said I was interested in neuropsychiatric diseases and so on. So I went
Mm.
very deep down there. I was also very interested, in psychedelics, altered states of consciousness. So that, our university really brought together two groups because we had the neuroscience department and the pharmacology department together. So you had all these massive nerds who just really were interested about how drugs work. Like, I'm going to be honest,
Yeah.
it was incredible. We also did some really stupid things. But I studied that at the very deep level. That means I studied not only neuroscience, but also how systemically pharmacology works. So the whole body, the system, like the cardiovascular, the renal, and so on. And that to me really started opening my eyes about the fact that maybe that's not exactly what I thought it was. All of a sudden you realize you really are just looking at the symptoms. You're
Mm.
not taking into consideration how the whole body works. You're taking one symptom, you're like, okay, how can we perturb this, let's say molecule, this enzyme, like 10 steps down the line to stop the symptom? But you don't look at where it's coming from. You don't look at why is it there in the first place. You're saying this mechanism is broken, quote unquote, but you don't ask, well, why is it broken? Why is it in some people this happens? And the people will start going up with, genetic predispositions and this. And sure, genetics plays a certain role, but we know like less than
Environment.
2%. Yeah, less than
Mm.
2% of diseases are genetically determined. If you have that gene, you will get the disease, less than 2%. So we should start asking some questions about the other 98. Then I also had an experience when I worked actually during my bachelor and master's thesis on a project that was sponsored by a spin-off company from the same university. So there's a company who was developing a drug, and they made a claim in their paper, in their clinical trials, about how the drug worked. And our laboratory was tasked with finding out. And as you can imagine, the results ended
Finding
up being
those
very,
results
yeah,
different. Yeah.
I'm still proud. I mean, like, I wish someone would publish my master thesis because I ripped them apart because the science that they
Mm.
used for clinical trials was crap, like absolute
Mm.
crap. I'd
Very
stopped
common.
following where that went. It was stage 2 clinical trials at the time. But, it was one of those cases that when I actually showed how that drug worked, it could have very negative consequences for the patients that it was meant for. Because of downstream just mechanisms, molecular mechanisms. So that was also, that was kind of my exposure where I was like, Yeah, that's not cool. Okay.
You saw it firsthand.
I saw
Yeah.
it firsthand. And once you see it firsthand and, you see it, to me, a lot of the times it's the little things. It's the little things of bringing these results to your supervisor and seeing, the fear, seeing the nervousness of like, shit, like, what do we do with this? Because now we have this information that those people don't want to hear. That for me, like, I'm very good at reading people. I'm very good at seeing emotions. And it's these little moments that actually tell you the most about where things are really at before the big words, before you can really like think of what you're going to say. And it's these little moments when you're like, oh, this is not what we were planning. And it's a question, do we tell them the truth or do we keep things status quo? Right? Which it seems to be a question these days a lot of the time. So that for me was really kind of like a first-hand introduction.
Eye-opening.
Now, what was happening in parallel for me was that I also grew up with a lot of health problems myself. And so when I started my PhD, I went through a very big burnout. I went through a lot of situations that really took a huge, huge toll on my body. And at the time, it became really clear to me that Western science was not going to help me with that because I knew how it worked. And that is actually how I started going down the natural healing path, where eventually I started really, I managed to heal everything from, chronic immune conditions, etc., that I was told would never be curable. And I'm clear of them completely after a few years. So for me, that was then really the shift, like into kind of an awakening around these industries and what is possible and how much we know in terms of how we could help so many people in completely very safe ways, quite frankly, very effective ways, much safer. And a lot of the time, a lot more effective than what pharmaceutical industry has to offer, especially when it comes to chronic conditions. And then I became acquainted with censorship, that I became acquainted with everything else that's happening to suppress the information that could provide people with very, very helpful knowledge. And that to me was a very big wake up call. I was like, okay, when I see censorship, I know something's very wrong because if we have to suppress information, we should really start asking questions. So that's really for me how I shifted to that. The biggest issue I have to this day with Western medicine is the lack of examining the root cause. I'm by no means an opponent of Western medicine. I think there is space and time for it. I think it has created some amazing discoveries that absolutely win over holistic medicine when it comes to acute, difficult issues. If I broke my leg, I would go to a Western doctor. If I had sepsis, please give me antibiotics, right? It is when it comes to these chronic conditions that we started using Western medicine as a replacement for something much more effective and honestly better for this specific case. And Western medicine's biggest problem is it doesn't look at the root cause. It doesn't want to, because if you heal people at the root cause, you lose clients. Let's be honest. And
Yeah.
for me, I started going really deep down first with the health. And then this journey brought me to first, it was very much a physical level, changing the diet, detoxes, etc. But eventually I came to understanding of how emotions affect our health, how our beliefs affect our health. And this is when I started understanding the root causes at a lot deeper level. And so I first worked with belief work and somatic work, and that with a lot of clients in natural health. And then recently, I really went fully into the subconscious beliefs because I started understanding, especially in the light of what's been happening in the past 6, 7 months in the world, in the Middle East, in Palestine.
Mm.
I started understanding how, because I'm very passionate about activism, collective liberation, and injustice as well, social injustice, about how these subconscious beliefs perpetuate massive amounts of suffering. And, collections of beliefs that we can talk about are, let's talk about we are the chosen people, which is right now one of the beliefs behind the genocide. These are ancestral beliefs, again, like towards our brothers and sisters, like Arab, Muslim, we've been subjected to so much propaganda. All Arabs are terrorists. Arab men are rapists. Like and you can test yourself to see if you hold these beliefs. Like your body will tell you there are ways to do that, very simple ways. But then we have a whole other set of beliefs, which is called anthropocentrism, which is saying human is at the center of the universe. Animals, plants, the natural world is only valuable as far as it can serve a human. That's utilitarianism. These are all belief systems. And it's these belief systems that are the root cause behind why we kill each other, why we're ethnically cleansing, why we're destroying our environment. And I love a good root cause, when you can work at the root cause level, you can really start making change. And so I completely shifted into that direction. And the way I work now has kind of like two pathways. The first one is really working with entrepreneurs to help them bring their medicine to the world because it's important. We need as many people as possible right now who are speaking about relevant things, which are going to help us move humanity forward. Because right now, I don't believe it's a time in the history where we can just randomly explore things and have fun. Like, we're in a pickle. Like, as
Yeah, it's a
humanity,
crisis. Yeah,
it's a crisis. So we
yeah,
need solutions. We need to make change, right? And so we need people who can honestly just raise consciousness of the planet, change the way people
mm,
think, change the way people behave. And then the other avenue that I'm working on the side, which I'm hoping to release in a year or two, is actually releasing programs that help us deprogram these beliefs that I talked about towards other groups of people, how we perceive nature and so on, so that we can uproot that. And then as we uproot these beliefs, our behavior will change, our relationships change, everything shifts once you change that. So that's because I started really realizing this is it. Like, this is at the core. When you dig deeper and deeper and deeper, you come to these belief systems, because it's belief systems that create our identity, and our identity that informs our actions. So that's kind of was my whole journey. It's been quite a long one, but it's helpful. Having this background helps me, I think, see things from, like, I understand why people think the way they think. I understand why people perceive these systems that are status quo the way they do. I understand the indoctrination, quite frankly, because it's
mm.
indoctrination. And that's helpful in understanding how to speak about these things. It helps you have compassion, but it helps you also really see and discern where the issues are. What are the common denominators? What do we have to really change? What are the conversations we need to be having in order to see change happen?
I couldn't agree more. And I love where the core of the intention behind what you're doing is, because I believe that the evolution of humanity isn't us creating things outside of ourselves. It's actually us connecting with the truth of who we are and becoming
Exactly.
our most authentic selves, because we all have a
Yes.
purpose on this earth. And ultimately, it serves to progress us as a species and serve humanity as a whole instead of the self at the forefront. And once we share that authenticity with the world and fulfill our purpose, we then evolve as a species. And the thing that's sort of getting in the way of that is the disconnect. We're
Yes.
disconnected from ourselves, we're disconnected from nature and our environment, from one another. And then there's this disconnect with individuals and the world. And I think that's behind why so many people don't want to be alive anymore, don't want to
Yes.
continue to try and survive this kind of
Yes.
life that we live in, this dog eat dog world. So
Yep.
people like you truly give me so much gratitude, and it's kind of like a boost to my soul, because I know that there are so many people out there trying to do this in their own way. So I thank you so much for sharing all the knowledge and information that you have with us. I think we've barely scratched the surface and getting into where you are now and what you do and your understanding of that. So I think the audience will be with me in wanting to have you on again if you're interested.
Would be
I
my pleasure.
absolutely, yeah, we need to explore this a lot deeper. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thanks for being with us.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. And thank you everyone who's listening to this. And I share your gratitude as well in this, just saying out, like, thank you to everyone who's doing this work. And thank you to everyone who is doing the work. A lot of people are waking up. The change is coming. We just need to keep going. We just are not stopping. And we have to trust, like, really, really, really trust in ourselves, trust in our vision. Um, and we're very strong together. It's when we forget that we start feeling, you know,
Alone.
powerless.
It's
Yeah.
it's power in numbers, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So thanks for being here with us for this app. New ones will come out to you every other Thursday. If you'd like to get in touch with Alja for your own work personally, I'll have her details in the show notes. And to stay up to date with the world of Aliamo, follow me on socials. Have a good one, people, and I'll see you soon.